So tying together this month's theme of roots and tomorrow's federal holiday, you learn a little bit about me to know that I'm a ninth-generation veteran. To my knowledge, none of these women and men in my family was career military. They simply answered their nation's call. Similarly, whether Catholics, Mormons, Methodists, or Lutherans, my family identifies with conservative Christian values. These are my roots. At times in my spiritual and ideological journey, I have faithfully responded to a sense of calling that took me further from my roots than I liked. My roots provide me with context. They contribute to my respect for values. I have come to learn that they do not, however, encapsulate me. My life and my journey are my own, and are not a perfect pattern for anyone else to follow. That said, I share with you some highlights, which, if they are not instructive, they may at least be interesting. These will include military and missionary service overseas as a younger man, college and seminary, and my ministry as an active duty Army chaplain. Although I have always experienced strong patriotic stirrings, so strong that they sometimes seem spiritual in nature, I joined the Army out of high school, mostly for practical reasons, the GI Bill. However, my 2-year enlistment as a tanker in Germany provided me a profound cultural and ideological perspective. I found German culture and history fascinating. Germans, however, didn't share my nationalistic enthusiasm. Still flowing in their collective consciousness was a nightmarish recollection of their own nationalistic fervor. As a guest in their country, I felt obligated to be patient with my hosts. And yet, in retrospect, I'm able to appreciate their patience with me and my youthful zeal and naivete. Following my military service in Europe, I did missions work in Asia, the Philippines to be exact. I love the Filipino people. They taught me much more than I taught them. Early on, some of us organized a community cleanup in metropolitan Manila, the most densely populated city in the world. There was litter everywhere. We thought such a cleanup would help demonstrate our responsibility to be better stewards of the earth. This breathed swell. But those of us who organized the event were Americans. We failed to consult with our Filipino companions. 5 minutes into the event, we realized our mistake. Most of the litter was discarded trash and partially buried in the dirt of the neighborhood. No problem. We were committed to doing a thorough job and pulled it up, only to discover more garbage below. To our surprise, the entire neighborhood, and probably much of the city, was built on a garbage heap. We wanted to help inspire pride and responsibility. We wanted to respond to Jesus' teaching to love our neighbor. But because we failed to include our neighbors in the planning, which would have been a more horizontal and mutual respect, we approached our Christian service in a vertical or condescending manner. Our designs backfired. Our hosts found it difficult to look us in the eyes. They were ashamed. We had failed. I am thankful for that failure. I continue to learn from it. After a meaningful 2 years among my Filipino sisters and brothers, I returned to the States to begin college. At 23, I fancied myself an amateur biblical scholar. At Florida Southern College, a small, private, liberal arts school affiliated with the United Methodist Church, I was introduced to the historical critical method of reading historical texts. I was entirely unprepared for the seismic shift this would have on my faith. Reading Scripture from a more responsibly understood context caused me to wrestle with many, even most, of my faith claims. My experience of following God's call to love my neighbor was transcendent, often sublime. But now that many of my presuppositions were seriously challenged, I wondered whether I had simply sought out delusional. While majoring in English, religion, and philosophy, and later in seminary at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, I experienced a 10-year crisis of faith. My religious experiences were too foundational, too beautiful to disregard. But my more sophisticated understanding of the universe was just as precious to me. I learned that there was devotion and virtue in allowing the evidence to inform the research. I learned from wise women and men how to faithfully reconstruct what reason and science have responsibly dismantled. Mine was becoming a more thoughtful faith. Near the end of his ministry, Jesus tried to comfort his disciples by assuring them that even though he was leaving, his Father would provide a comforter to guide them. It has been my experience that the comforter routinely calls me outside of my comfort zone. As you may know, the professional ministry degree, the Master's of Divinity, usually requires a ministry internship with a congregation and then a field study of some sort. I did my internship at the United Church of Hyde Park, a single congregation whose members were United Methodist, Presbyterian Church USA, or United Church of Christ. The diversity proved a wonderful context of people coming together across some pretty sticky issues to serve as a collective instrument of peace. Next, my field study with the National Human Relations Organization turned into a 4-year full-time job as the Director of Interfaith Programs. I worked with leaders across America's religious spectrum. While never abandoning the faith of my fathers, my spiritual roots, I became a better Christian because of my deep and abiding relationships with Hindus, Jains, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Baha'is, Sikhs, and Zaratustris. Although my interactions with these sisters and brothers blessed my life, it was often uncomfortable and sometimes confusing. It was tempting to give into seeing things in a black and white or absolute terms. To be very clear, I am not a strict relativist. I believe good and evil exist in both moral and religious realms. I do not believe all religions are of equal value to their adherents. I believe it disingenuous and fear-motivated for people of various faiths to come together and pretend they agree on everything. Our differences matter, and we should own them, discuss them as appropriate, and reevaluate them as needed. I am in awe of your congregation and this religious tradition's success at harvesting the rich goodness of the world's religious and philosophical traditions. Understanding these few highlights from my personal journey may help you appreciate my formal ministry as an active duty Army chaplain. I left Chicago 10 years ago to serve the women and men of this nation's military. My strong personal feelings against our political leaders' decision to go to war were overshadowed by my sense of calling to be present with soldiers and their families during these difficult times. A few facts about the chaplaincy may be helpful. The United States has had military chaplains since General Washington commissioned them for the Continental Army in 1775. Today we have chaplains in the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. Marines are supplied chaplains by the Navy. And for anyone who cares, today is the birthday of the Marine Corps. Of the roughly 1,600 active duty Army chaplains, about 90% are Catholic, Orthodox, or some form of Protestant. And although not accurate on many levels, the few Unitarian chaplains are lumped into this latter category. The others are Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, or Hindu. Less than 5% are women. A chaplain must be trained and endorsed by a specific religious body or denomination, and serves as a commissioned officer in one of the branches of the military. Of course, there are also chaplains in hospitals, prisons, and many universities and campuses. Military chaplains are non-combatants. We neither train nor carry weapons. We are, however, assigned an enlisted soldier who is our chaplain assistant. Chaplain assistant's primary duty is the chaplain's safety and security on the battlefield. So in a manner of speaking, chaplain assistant is my bodyguard. I had scarcely completed my initial training as a chaplain when I deployed to Iraq with soldiers from the Army's 3rd Infantry Division. It was difficult being away from my little family. When I deployed, my wife was 3 months pregnant, and I was unable to be present for the birth of our second child. But my challenges and difficulties were the soldiers' challenges and difficulties too. Together we suffered the threats of combat, the serious injuries and deaths of our fellow soldiers, extreme weather, and of course, separation from our families back home. In seminary, I had learned of incarnational ministry, or as some call it, the ministry of presence. Being present with people in their suffering is ministry. Chaplain ministry is nothing if it isn't incarnational. This is especially the case in combat. As a chaplain in combat, less than 10% of my time is spent planning and conducting worship services and religious education. I spend a good deal of time counseling with soldiers struggling with grief, loss, fear, doubt, anger, depression, and family issues. More than half of our soldiers live and work out of small combat outposts on the battlefield. Meaningful ministry requires a good deal of travel on roads laden with improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. My second combat deployment was for 15 months. Most weeks I was on the road Monday through Friday and returned to our main camp on the weekends to attend to the leaders and soldiers of our headquarters. One of the most difficult duties as a chaplain is to conduct ramp and memorial ceremonies when a soldier dies. At the ramp of the plane where a deceased soldier's remains are loaded and sent back to his or her family in the States, a simple ceremony of prayer and silence is conducted. A few days later, allowing for preparation and transportation, a chaplain conducts a memorial ceremony with leaders and soldiers to commemorate the deceased soldier's life. Several time-honored traditions take place, and as you can easily imagine, this is painful for all involved. As with any religious leader, chaplains are present at both the toughest and the most joyous times of life. Births, marriages, graduations, divorces, retirements, and death. Although I pray daily for peace and wish humanity would never fight another war, I will tell you that in combat there are good times too. I'll share 2 highlights with you. 15 years before my first deployment, I had been a tanker, a combat arms soldier who had trained on multiple weapon systems. It now somehow seems strange to me to go to war without a weapon. Soldiers were puzzled by this too. I reasoned to myself and explained to them that I forfeited my Second Amendment rights, the right to bear arms, in order to protect their First Amendment rights, the free exercise of religion. Anticipating downtime and wanting to be helpful, I deployed with a barber kit, and during my 2 combat tours, spending 27 months in Iraq, I gave well over 1,000 haircuts. I had neither a license nor training, but I had lots of experience, and soon learned to cut hair pretty well. Several of our female soldiers asked me to cut their hair too, with scissors, of course. Generous souls back in the States would keep me stocked of all supplies. And when my clipper blades would become dull or the motors of the clippers would burn up, they would replace them with professional grade sets. Everywhere I went, I would cut hair after worship services and counseling sessions. My rotator cuff, my shoulder, my back would give out after a few hours, so I had to take breaks. One particular soldier who sat in my chair was filthy. As I had for other soldiers, I handed him a bottle of water and told him he needed to wash his hair first if my clippers were going to work. He came back in with clean hair, but it had been days since he had showered, and he reeked of body odor. As I cut his hair, I struggled to maintain a spirit of compassionate service. A gentle but chastising thought came to me. I thought of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Their feet surely must have stunk, which may have been part of the reason why Peter resisted Jesus' charitable act. I immediately made several connections between cutting soldiers' hair and various elements of administering blessing and healing and comfort practiced in my own denomination. I stood behind a person sitting in a chair. I touched his head. I talked deeply about personal matters. I put oil on the blades of the clippers, much like I would anoint the sick with consecrated oil. While cutting hair, we might only be talking about college football, but we just as often talked about working through grief, ethical dilemmas, and relationships back home. It occurred to me that I wasn't merely cutting hair. I was an instrument of blessing. And unlike worship services, which were mostly attended by believers, everyone needed a haircut. My final highlight of ministry in combat happened in 2007 while supporting the Marines. My commander knew of my experience teaching world religions and working in interfaith relations. He had started meeting with the provincial sheikh of Ramadi in Fallujah and asked him if he would arrange for me to meet area imams. The sheikh agreed, and I had several meetings with provincial religious leaders over the course of several months that helped us develop relationships of mutual trust. Our unit's mission included working with Iraqi soldiers and police to provide security along supply routes and government offices. The majority of these Iraqis were practicing Muslims, and the upcoming observance of Ramadan and fasting posed an operational challenge to our cooperative efforts. I worked with the imams to plan a training event for our soldiers to better understand Iraqis' needs during Ramadan and to work to find solutions that would allow them to meet these needs while still fulfilling their joint security missions. Furthermore, students back home from Langston Chapel Elementary School had collected an entire freight container of school supplies and raised over $5,000 in a program called Pennies for Postage that paid to ship the supplies to us. The plan was to distribute them to school children in our district. Rather than do so ourselves, it made more sense to have local religious and law enforcement personnel join us in that task. Now, not intending criticism, Iraqi power culture, as many of you may know, like many other parts of the world, accepts bribery, grifting, and other forms of corruption as standard practice. We thought it would help empower leaders in the eyes of their fellow Iraqis if they distributed to the students the school supplies themselves. Our soldiers provided security and watched from the sidelines at several area schools while local leaders helped make a difference in their communities. Don't get me wrong, these efforts were relatively small. They didn't fix everything, and we didn't expect that they would. But before we arrived, 9 months earlier, political and tactical experts were calling Ramadi, the headquarters for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a lost cause. During our first couple months on the ground, we lost, on average, a soldier every 9 days. We had 3 members of a 4-man tank crew killed by a sniper within the space of 2 weeks. Demoralizing, to say the least. However, efforts to reach out and include local leaders helped shift the tide in the Sunni Triangle province of Al-Anbar, and it began to spread across Iraq. Again, I am not claiming credit for the success, nor am I claiming that it was a total success. But by the conclusion of Ramadan, it had been 4 months since a soldier was killed, and almost 2 months since the last combat-related hostility. And it turned out that there would not be another. Months later, as we prepared to redeploy to the States, I helped organize trips through the city for our soldiers who had taken part in the heaviest fighting during the early months of 2007. They witnessed schools and marketplaces where previously there were heated battles. Soldiers gained a more complete sense of purpose and meaning that for many would aid their healing and recovery in the years to come. The opportunity to witness such resolution, albeit limited resolution, is rare. I believe praying for peace and moving beyond fears of religious and cultural differences allowed for a semblance of peace to be realized. The title of today's message, Strong Enough to Bend, would please my wife, but horrify most sophisticated theologians, comes from a country music song by Tanya Tucker. I would like to share with you a couple of the stanzas. No, it is a love song and it is a country song, but I find it metaphorically instructive to each of us in our own way, and then applies to the message today. There's a tree out in the backyard that never has been broken by the wind. And the reason it's still standing, it was strong enough to bend. For years we have stayed together as lovers and as friends. What we have will last forever if we're strong enough to bend. When you say something that you can't take back, a big wind blows and you hear a little crack. When you say, hey, well, I might be wrong, you can sway with the wind till the storm is gone. When you start thinking that you know it all, a big wind blows and a branch will fall. When you say, hey, this job takes two, we can sway with the wind till the skies turn blue. Now trust me, I am completely aware of how complex, sticky, and difficult life's problems are, and that a country song in no way, shape, or form fixes it all. But as I've been familiar with these lyrics for going on 30 years now, I find that they are instructive in the humility that's necessary for us to learn from one another and yet remain faithful to those principles and values which define us. In my 10 years as an Army chaplain, my 4 months of advanced training here at Redstone Arsenal allows me a special freedom. As with my classmates and other military specialists, I have no professional duties while a student. I am not expected to assist the chaplain at Redstone Arsenal with services from Sunday. And although I miss my family who remain at my current duty station at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, my status as both a student and a geographical bachelor allows me the freedom to worship unconstrained. It has been a blessing to spend this portion of my journey with you. Thank you for sharing yourselves and your community with me. I assure you that not only will our interaction help me mature in my faith, but it will also help inform a more responsible ministry to our soldiers and their families. I pray all of us will be more open-minded to being called out of our respective comfort zones, that our lives may more fully resemble that peace